My father-in-law left me his entire estate instead of his own children, so they're claiming I manipulated a dying man. The accusation started 3 days after Theodore's funeral. I was still wearing the black dress I'd bought for Camden's service 2 years earlier when the lawyer called. There's been a development, he said carefully. Bryce and Kendra are contesting the will. I wasn't surprised. At the reading, when Theodore's children learned their father had left his $3 million estate to his dead son's widow instead of them, Kendra's face went white with rage. This is impossible, she'd hissed. Dad was confused, medicated. She manipulated him. Bryce just stared at me with cold calculation. We'll be in touch, he said as they stormed out. Theodore and I had gotten close after Camden died. My husband was only 34 when the heart attack took him, leaving me a 29-year-old widow drowning in grief and medical bills. While Bryce and Kendra lived their busy lives in other states, I was the one who drove Theodore to chemo appointments, organized his medications, and held his hand during the worst nights. You're the daughter I never had, he'd tell me. Bryce only calls when he needs money, and Kendra hasn't visited in 3 years. It was true. During Theodore's entire cancer battle, Bryce visited twice, and Kendra sent flowers once. I slept in the hospital chair during his worst episodes, learned to manage his pain pump, and researched experimental treatments when the doctors ran out of options. The manipulation accusations hurt because they weren't entirely baseless. I had influenced Theodore's decision, just not how they imagined. It started 6 months before he died, when Theodore asked me about my financial situation. I'd been honest about the medical debt from Camden's final months, how I was working double shifts as a dental hygienist just to stay afloat. Camden would want me to take care of you, he said. Let me help. I refused his offers of money, but Theodore was persistent, strategic. He started small, paying for groceries, covering my car repair, insisting it was what Camden would have wanted. Each time I protested, he'd get that stubborn look that reminded me so much of my dead husband. Then came the conversation that changed everything. Theodore had just finished a particularly brutal round of chemo. We were sitting in his hospital room when he brought up his will. Bryce and Kendra don't need my money, he said quietly. Bryce makes 6 figures in tech. Kendra married that hedge fund manager. But you, he trailed off, but I knew what he meant. I was struggling while his biological children lived comfortably, rarely bothering to check on their dying father. I want to change my will, he announced. Leave everything to you. Theodore, no, I said immediately. That's not right. They're your children. Are they? He asked bitterly. When's the last time either of them called just to talk? When have they ever put my needs before their convenience? I spent 3 weeks trying to talk him out of it. I suggested splitting the estate, leaving me a smaller portion. But Theodore was adamant. You've been more family to me in 2 years than they've been in decades, he said. This is my decision. The day he signed the new will, I felt sick with guilt. Not because I'd manipulated him, but because part of me was relieved. Camden's medical bills had destroyed my credit. I was facing bankruptcy. Now, looking at the legal papers Bryce and Kendra had filed, I saw their strategy. They claimed I'd isolated Theodore from his family, influenced him while he was on pain medication, and exploited his grief over Camden's death. The worst part? Some of it sounded plausible, even to me. But what they didn't know was that Theodore had anticipated this fight. 3 days before he died, barely conscious from the morphine, he'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength. In my desk, he whispered. Bottom drawer, hidden compartment. I'd thought it was delirium, but after reading their legal filing, I knew I had to check. What I found in that hidden compartment would change everything about this inheritance battle. Theodore's house felt different without him. Every room held memories, him dozing in his recliner during chemo treatments, teaching me to make his mother's cornbread recipe, showing me photo albums from Camden's childhood that I'd never seen. His study remained exactly as he'd left it. The mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface covered with prescription bottles, legal documents, and the Stephen King novel he'd been reading when he got too weak to focus. I ran my fingers along the bottom drawer, feeling for any irregularities. There, a small depression in the wood. When I pressed it, a narrow panel slid away, revealing a hidden compartment barely big enough for an envelope. Inside were 3 items that made my hands shake. A USB drive, a letter addressed to me, and a manila folder labeled Evidence. I opened the letter first. Theodore's familiar handwriting, though shakier than usual, filled 2 pages. My dear daughter-in-law, if you're reading this, then Bryce and Kendra are likely challenging my will. I anticipated this, which is why I spent the last year documenting everything. The USB drive contains recordings of every conversation I had with my children over the past 18 months. You'll hear exactly how often they called, what they said about my illness, and their true feelings about you and Camden. The folder contains financial records showing how they've treated me as their personal ATM for years, along with evidence of their real character. I'm not giving you this to hurt them, but to protect what's rightfully yours. You earned this inheritance through love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Don't let them take what Camden would have wanted you to have. All my love, Theodore. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop with trembling fingers. The files were organized by date, each one labeled with Theodore's meticulous attention to detail. The first recording was from 13 months ago, Bryce calling after Theodore's initial cancer diagnosis. Hey Dad, heard about the C word. That sucks. Listen, I've got this startup opportunity, but I need about 15 grand to get in on the ground floor. Since you're not exactly spending much these days. Theodore's voice was steady but sad. Bryce, I just started chemotherapy. I might need that money for medical expenses. Come on, Dad, you've got great insurance. This is a sure thing. I'll pay you back with interest. The next file was Kendra, 2 weeks later. Daddy, I'm so sorry about your diagnosis. I wanted to visit, but you know how crazy things are with the kids and Preston's work schedule. Hey, did Bryce mention his investment thing? Because we could really use some help with Madison's private school tuition. It's only $8,000 per semester, and you always said education was important. I listened to months of these calls. Requests for money disguised as concern. Excuses for why they couldn't visit wrapped in false sympathy. And worst of all, their conversations about me. Bryce's voice on a call from 6 months ago made my stomach turn. I still don't understand why you're so attached to Camden's widow. She's not even family anymore. You should focus on your real children. Kendra was even crueler. She's obviously trying to position herself as your caregiver so she can get something when you die. It's actually pretty manipulative when you think about it. Theodore's response was quietly devastating. She's here every day, making sure I take my medications and get to appointments. She held my hand during my worst chemo session while you were at a wine tasting in Napa. Tell me again who's being manipulative. But the recordings revealed so much more than just their greed and neglect. They painted a picture of two adults who had never learned to see their father as anything more than a resource to be exploited. One particularly painful conversation from 8 months ago showed just how little they understood about Theodore's condition. Kendra had called during one of his worst weeks, when the chemotherapy had left him so weak he could barely lift his head. "Daddy, I need to talk to you about something important," she'd said, her voice bright and oblivious. "Preston's company is having this charity auction, and I promised we'd donate something significant. Could you write a check for maybe $5,000? It's for the children's hospital, so it's basically a tax write-off anyway." Theodore's voice was barely a whisper. "Kendra, I'm having a really bad day. The chemo—" "Oh, come on. It can't be that bad. You always were a bit dramatic about being sick. Remember when you had that flu when I was 16? You acted like you were dying then too." I remembered that day. I'd found Theodore crying in his bathroom after the call, not from physical pain but from the devastating realization that his own daughter saw his cancer battle as an act. The recording of Bryce from the same period was even worse. He'd called on a Tuesday evening, right after Theodore had received news that the first round of chemotherapy hadn't been as effective as hoped. "Dad, quick question. I'm looking at this investment property, but I need to move fast. Could you wire me 30 grand by Friday? I know it sounds like a lot, but the potential return is massive. Bryce, I just got some difficult news from my oncologist." Yeah, I'm sure it's fine. These doctors always give worst-case scenarios to cover themselves legally. Anyway, about that wire transfer. Theodore had tried again to explain the severity of his situation, but Bryce had cut him off with impatience. "Dad, you're going to beat this thing. You're too stubborn to die. But this property won't wait. So can you get that money to me or not?" What hurt most was listening to Theodore's voice change over the months. In early recordings, he still held on to hope that his children might step up, that the crisis would bring the family together. By the later files, resignation had crept in. He stopped trying to share details about his treatment, stopped asking about their lives, stopped expecting anything beyond their financial requests. The folder of financial records was equally damning. Theodore had kept meticulous documentation going back 7 years, showing a pattern of one-sided financial support that had accelerated dramatically since Camden's death. Bryce's requests weren't just frequent. They were calculated. He always called right after Theodore received insurance payouts, or when he knew his father had received income from his rental properties. The amounts escalated over time, starting with a few hundred for car trouble, and eventually reaching the $15,000 startup investment. But it wasn't just the money. Theodore had documented every promise to pay him back, every excuse for why the repayment was delayed, every new crisis that required forgiveness of the previous debt. Bryce owed his father over $67,000 and had never repaid a single dollar. Kendra's pattern was different, but equally manipulative. She positioned her requests as investments in Theodore's grandchildren, knowing he wouldn't refuse anything framed as being for Madison and Tyler's benefit. Private school tuition, summer camps, tennis lessons, tutoring. She had convinced her father to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford by claiming it was all for the children's education and development. The records showed she'd received $43,000 over 5 years, always with tearful explanations about wanting to give her children opportunities she'd never had. But Theodore had also documented the Facebook posts she'd shared, showing expensive vacations, designer clothes, and restaurant bills that proved the money wasn't all going to the children. Most damning was a text message chain Theodore had screenshotted between Kendra and Bryce from 3 months before his death. They'd been coordinating their requests to avoid asking for money at the same time, treating their dying father like a business to be managed efficiently. "Kendra, did you ask about the investment thing yet?" Bryce, "Not yet. Waiting for his next doctor appointment. He always feels guilty about being a burden after medical stuff." Kendra, "Smart. I'm going to hit him up for Madison's summer program next week. Tyler needs new hockey equipment too." Bryce, "Think we should space it out more? Don't want him getting suspicious." Kendra, "Please. He's too far gone to notice patterns. Besides, what's he going to do with the money anyway? At least we're putting it to good use." Bryce, "True. Just wish Camden's widow would stop hovering. She makes him feel like he doesn't need us anymore." Kendra, "I know. It's honestly gross how she's attached herself to him. Like, get a life." Reading those messages felt like a physical blow. While they were strategizing how to extract more money from their dying father, I was learning to cook his favorite foods because chemotherapy had destroyed his appetite. While they saw his generosity as weakness to be exploited, I was driving him to 6 a.m. medical appointments because the steroids made him too wired to sleep. But the evidence went deeper than just financial manipulation. Theodore had documented instances of emotional manipulation that painted an even darker picture of his children's character. One particularly cruel example was from Kendra during Theodore's first surgery. She'd called him the night before, supposedly to offer support, but the conversation had quickly turned manipulative. "Daddy, I'm so scared about tomorrow," she'd said, her her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. I keep thinking about what would happen if something went wrong. The kids would be devastated to lose their grandfather. Theodore had tried to comfort her, assuring her that the surgery was routine, and the doctors were optimistic. I know, Kendra had continued. It's just that Preston's been so stressed about money lately, and if something happened to you, I don't know how we'd manage. Not financially, I mean. Well, maybe financially too, but mostly emotionally. The kids depend on you so much. She'd managed to work in a request for emergency funds, while simultaneously making Theodore feel guilty for putting his family through the stress of his illness. The recording captured him agreeing to transfer $5,000 for Tyler's hockey tournament fees, even though he was scheduled for surgery in 12 hours. Bryce's manipulation was more direct but equally calculating. He'd started calling Theodore Pops after the cancer diagnosis, a nickname he'd never used before. The term appeared in text messages, always followed by requests for money, as if the artificial intimacy would make Theodore more likely to say yes. The most disturbing recording was from Bryce just 6 weeks before Theodore's death. By this point, Theodore was confined to bed most days. His weight had dropped 40 pounds, and he was struggling to maintain coherent conversations due to pain medication. "Hey, Pops, how are you feeling today?" Bryce had asked with forced cheerfulness. "Not great, son. The doctors are talking about transitioning to comfort care." "What does that mean exactly?" Bryce had asked, and for a moment I thought he was showing genuine concern. "It means they can't cure the cancer anymore. We're just trying to keep me comfortable for whatever time I have left." There was a pause. Then Bryce's voice changed to business mode. "Well, in that case, we should probably talk about some financial planning. I've been researching tax implications of inheritance, and there might be some strategies we should implement now to minimize what the government takes." Theodore's voice was weak but incredulous. "Bryce, I just told you I'm dying, and you want to talk about taxes? I'm trying to be practical, Pops. You'd want your money to go to family, not the IRS, right? There are some trust structures we could set up, some gifts we could make now to avoid estate taxes later. I've got a lawyer friend who could help us out." The conversation had continued for 20 minutes, with Bryce pushing various schemes to move Theodore's assets before his death. Not once did he ask about his father's pain levels, his fears, or how he could provide emotional support during this transition to end-of-life care. When Theodore had finally said he was too tired to continue the conversation, Bryce's parting words were, "Just think about it, Pops. Time isn't exactly on our side here." Listening to that recording, I understood why Theodore had made his decision about the will. This wasn't about money, it was about dignity. He'd realized that his biological children saw his approaching death primarily as a financial opportunity to be optimized, rather than a loss to be grieved. The contrast with my own interactions couldn't have been starker. Theodore had also recorded several of our conversations, apparently to document the difference in how he was treated. In one from around the same time as Bryce's tax planning call, I'd been helping Theodore organize his medications when he'd brought up his mortality. "I know this is hard for you," he'd said. "Losing Camden was enough tragedy for one lifetime. You shouldn't have to watch another person you care about fade away." "It's not about what I should or shouldn't have to do," I'd replied. "It's about what you need. And right now, you need someone who sees you as more than your medical condition or your bank account. You need family." "You really think of me as family?" he'd asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course I do. You're Camden's father. You raised the man I loved. That makes you my family too, forever. Money and wills and inheritance don't change that." The recording captured him crying, something I'd thought he'd hidden from me at the time. Later in the same conversation, he'd asked about my financial struggles, and I'd deflected, not wanting to burden him with my problems. "Camden always said you were terrible at asking for help," he'd said with gentle humor. "He made me promise to look out for you if anything ever happened to him. Please let me keep that promise." Even then, I'd tried to minimize my needs, suggesting he save his energy and resources for his treatment. It was Theodore who'd insisted on paying for my groceries that week, and the recording captured me protesting every step of the way. "You've given me something more valuable than money," I'd told him. "You've shared Camden's childhood stories, his favorite recipes, parts of him I never knew. That's worth more than anything else you could give me." The difference between these conversations and those with his biological children was stark. Where Bryce and Kendra called with demands disguised as needs, I consistently tried to give rather than take. Where they saw opportunity in his vulnerability, I saw a man deserving of dignity and compassion. But the most revealing evidence wasn't in the recordings or financial documents. It was in Theodore's private journal entries, which he'd transcribed and included in the evidence folder. The entries spanned the entire 18 months of his illness, providing insight into his mental state and decision-making process that would prove crucial in the legal battle ahead. The early entries showed a man holding on to hope that his illness might bring his family closer together. Told the kids about the diagnosis today, Bryce seemed more concerned about how this might affect his visit plans for Christmas than about the actual cancer. Kendra cried, but then immediately started talking about how stressed this makes her. Neither asked about treatment options or prognosis. Maybe they're just processing the shock. First chemo session tomorrow. Camden's widow offered to drive me and sit with me during the infusion. I told her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted. She's been through enough medical trauma for one lifetime. Bryce said he'd try to call during the treatment if his schedule allowed. Chemo was rough, but having someone there helped. She brought magazines, snacks, even a phone charger because she knew the sessions are long. Talked to me about everything except cancer. Camden's favorite movies, her work at the dental office, books she's reading. Made the time pass quickly. Bryce never called. As the months progressed, the entries revealed Theodore's growing awareness of the disparity in how his children treated him. Kendra finally visited for Tyler's birthday weekend, spent more time on her phone than talking to me. Asked for money for Tyler's orthodontics 3 times in 2 days. Didn't mention the cancer until I brought it up, then changed the subject to her kitchen renovation plans. She seems to see my illness as an inconvenience to her normal life. Bryce called with another investment opportunity. When I mentioned that the latest scans showed some tumor growth, he said, "That sucks," and immediately went back to explaining his business plan. I don't think he even processed what I'd said. How did I raise someone so disconnected from other people's pain? Had a terrible reaction to the new medication cocktail. Ended up in the ER at 3 a.m. Camden's widow was there in 20 minutes, still in her pajamas. Stayed until I was discharged 8 hours later. Didn't complain once about missing work or being tired. Bryce sent a text the next day asking if I was still in the hospital or whatever. The entries around the time Theodore decided to change his will were particularly poignant. Been thinking a lot about legacy lately. What does it mean to leave something behind? Bryce and Kendra will split my money and probably fight over the house. But will they remember how I liked my coffee? Will they tell their children stories about their grandfather? Will they visit my grave more than once a year? She knows I take my pills at 8 p.m. and always asks if I remembered them. She knows I can't sleep without the humidifier running. She knows I get nauseated if I eat too soon after chemo. These are the things family members know about each other. When did my own children stop paying attention to who I actually am? Made the decision today. Camden would want his wife taken care of, and she's the only one who's actually taken care of me. Bryce and Kendra will be angry, but they forfeited their claim to my care when they chose to see me as a resource instead of a person. The final entries, written in the weeks before his death, showed a man at peace with his decision. Signed the new will today. She tried to talk me out of it again, suggested leaving her just enough to pay off Camden's medical bills. But this isn't about her. It's about them. They need to learn that relationships can't be transactional forever. Maybe losing the inheritance will teach them something about the value of genuine connection. Overheard her on the phone with her friend, talking about how worried she is about me. Not about money or inheritance. About whether I'm in pain, whether I'm scared, whether there's anything else she can do to help. This is what love sounds like. I'd forgotten. Hard day today. Pain is getting worse. She sat with me for 6 hours, reading aloud from my favorite book because the morphine makes it hard to focus on the pages. Bryce called and she answered, explained I was having a rough day. He said, "Tell him I'll try to call back later," and hung up. She didn't tell me he'd called until the next day, and only because I asked if anyone had checked on me. She was protecting me from their indifference even while I was too medicated to notice. The last entry was dated 3 days before Theodore's death. Getting close now. Told her about the hidden compartment today. She'll need the evidence when Bryce and Kendra try to challenge the will. They will, of course, not because they loved me, but because they counted on my money being there for them. I hope someday they'll understand that I didn't cut them out to be cruel. I cut them out because they cut themselves out years ago. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, I contacted my attorney, Margaret Reeves, a state litigation specialist who came highly recommended. She was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair and the sharpest legal mind I'd ever encountered. "This is remarkable," she said after reviewing Theodore's documentation. "I've never seen someone anticipate a will contest this thoroughly. Your father-in-law essentially built our entire defense case before he died." The legal battle began in earnest 2 weeks later, when Bryce and Kendra filed their formal contest. They'd hired Pemberton and Associates, one of the most expensive estate litigation firms in the state. Their strategy became clear from the first filing. They would argue that Theodore had been mentally incompetent due to medication and illness, that I had isolated him from his family and manipulated him during his vulnerable state, and that the drastic change in his will was evidence of undue influence. Their petition painted me as a calculating opportunist who had positioned herself as Theodore's caregiver to gain access to his finances. They claimed I had monitored his communications with his children, limited their access to him during his final months, and exploited his grief over Camden's death to convince him to change his will. Some of their allegations stung because they contained grains of truth twisted into sinister interpretation. Yes, I had been present for most of Theodore's medical appointments because no one else would take him. Yes, I had helped manage his medications because he was struggling to keep track of complex dosing schedules. Yes, I had become his primary emotional support because his biological children had abdicated that role. The depositions began 3 months into the case. Bryce went first, accompanied by his expensive lawyers and wearing a Navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He presented himself as a grieving son whose father had been manipulated by a scheming daughter-in-law. "My father was a proud man," Bryce testified. "He wouldn't have wanted to burden anyone with his illness, but she inserted herself into every aspect of his care, making herself indispensable. She isolated him from his family, convinced him we didn't care about him." Margaret's cross-examination was devastating. She played recording after recording of Bryce's calls to Theodore, each one focused on money rather than care. When she asked him to name Theodore's oncologist, Bryce couldn't answer. When she asked about Theodore's medication schedule, Bryce claimed he'd never needed to know such details. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said, "you've testified that the defendant isolated your father from his family. Can you tell me the last time you visited him without asking for money?" Bryce's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question. Bryce sat silent for nearly a full minute before admitting he couldn't remember. "Can you tell me about your father's treatment plan, his prognosis, his daily struggles with the side effects of chemotherapy?" Again, Bryce had no answers. Margaret played the recording of him discussing tax planning while Theodore was transitioning to hospice care. By the end of the deposition, Bryce looked less like a grieving son and more like what he was, a man angry about losing money he'd counted on inheriting. Kendra's deposition was even more damaging to their case. She'd clearly been coached to present herself as a devoted daughter who'd been cruelly cut out of her father's life, but her performance fell apart under scrutiny. "Mrs. Hamilton," Margaret began, You've testified that you had a close relationship with your father. Can you tell me about the last meaningful conversation you had with him that wasn't related to money? Kendra's eyes darted to her lawyers, then back to Margaret. We talked all the time. He was very interested in the children's activities, their school performance. I'm sure he was, but I'm asking about a conversation focused on him, his feelings, his fears, his needs. When did you last ask your father how he was coping emotionally with his diagnosis? The question hung in the air. Kendra's face flushed as she realized she couldn't answer. Margaret played recordings of Kendra's calls, each one revealing her complete focus on her own needs rather than her father's welfare. The moment that sealed her fate came when Margaret played the recording of Kendra dismissing Theodore's cancer battle as dramatic attention-seeking. Mrs. Hamilton, do you recall telling your father that he was being dramatic about his cancer, comparing it to a flu he'd had years earlier? That's taken out of context. I was just trying to keep his spirits up, encouraging him not to be negative. By minimizing his legitimate medical concerns, by suggesting his oncologists were wrong about the severity of his condition, Kendra's composure cracked completely. He was always a bit of a hypochondriac, she snapped. Even as children, we knew he exaggerated every little ache and pain. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing words that destroyed any sympathy Kendra might have garnered. Margaret let the statement hang in the air before moving on. The medical testimony phase of the trial was crucial to disproving claims that Theodore had been mentally incompetent. Dr. Patricia Voss, Theodore's oncologist, testified that while cancer and chemotherapy can affect cognitive function, Theodore had remained sharp and engaged throughout his treatment. Mr. Whitmore was remarkably informed about his condition, Dr. Voss testified. He researched treatment options, asked detailed questions about side effects, and made complex decisions about his care right up until his final week. I never observed any cognitive impairment that would affect his ability to make legal or financial decisions. Dr. Voss also testified about Theodore's mental state during his illness. He was very aware of the support system around him, often mentioning how grateful he was for his daughter-in-law's help. He seemed sad about his children's limited involvement, but not confused about the reality of their relationships. The pharmacy records subpoenaed by Margaret showed that while Theodore was on pain medication, the dosages were moderate and carefully managed. There was no evidence of the kind of heavy sedation that might impair judgment. But the most powerful testimony came from Theodore's home health nurse, Carmen Rodriguez, who had visited him twice weekly during his final months. Carmen was a 20-year veteran of hospice care who had seen countless families navigate terminal illness. Mr. Whitmore was one of the most mentally alert patients I've worked with, Carmen testified. Even in pain, he was tracking his medications, asking about his lab results, making jokes to lighten the mood. His daughter-in-law was usually there when I visited, and I could see how much he appreciated her presence. Carmen's observations about family dynamics were particularly damaging to Bryce and Kendra's case. In my experience, you can tell a lot about family relationships by how people behave when someone is dying. Mr. Whitmore's son and daughter called occasionally, but it was always the daughter-in-law who knew his comfort preferences, his medication schedule, his appetite patterns. She knew him better than anyone. When asked about the allegation that I had isolated Theodore from his family, Carmen was emphatic. Absolutely not. She encouraged him to call his children, helped him write emails when typing became difficult. I heard her several times suggesting he invite them to visit. The isolation came from their end, not hers. Margaret also called character witnesses who had observed Theodore and me together during his illness. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, testified about seeing me arrive every morning to help with breakfast and medications. The volunteer coordinator from his church spoke about how I had accompanied Theodore to services even when he was too weak to participate fully, just so he could maintain connection with his faith community. But perhaps the most compelling witness was Theodore's longtime attorney, James Morrison, who had prepared both the original will and the revision. Morrison testified that Theodore had been completely clear about his intentions when changing the will. Mr. Whitmore came to me with very specific instructions, Morrison testified. He wanted to leave his estate to his daughter-in-law because, in his words, she's the only one who's treated me like family instead of a bank account. He was lucid, adamant, and had clearly thought through the decision carefully. Morrison also testified that Theodore had anticipated the will contest and had specifically asked about steps to make his intentions legally bulletproof. He was concerned his biological children would challenge the will, not because they loved him, but because they expected his money. He wanted to make sure his true wishes would be honored. The trial phase began 6 months after the initial filing. Bryce and Kendra's legal team presented their case first, arguing that the will change was so dramatic and unexpected that it could only be explained by mental incompetence or undue influence. Their lead attorney, Richard Pemberton, was skilled at painting sympathetic pictures. He spoke movingly about children losing their father and then being cut out of his will by someone outside the family. He argued that cancer and chemotherapy had clouded Theodore's judgment, making him susceptible to manipulation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Pemberton said in his opening statement, this case is about a vulnerable, dying man who was systematically isolated from his family and convinced to disinherit his own children. The defendant may have started with good intentions, but somewhere along the way, caregiving became something darker, a calculated campaign to position herself as the sole beneficiary of a substantial estate. But Pemberton's case fell apart when confronted with Theodore's meticulous documentation. Every allegation of manipulation was contradicted by recordings, showing me encouraging Theodore to maintain contact with his children. Every claim of isolation was disproven by evidence that I had facilitated visits and phone calls that Bryce and Kendra had been too busy to make. When Margaret presented our defense, the evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of recordings showed the stark difference between how I treated Theodore and how his biological children interacted with him. Financial records proved that I had consistently refused Theodore's offers of money, while his children had treated him like a personal ATM. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret played Theodore's final recording, made just 1 week before his death. His voice was weak but determined. "I know my children will contest this, Will. They'll claim I wasn't in my right mind, that I was manipulated. But I want to be clear. I've never been more certain of any decision in my life. I'm leaving my estate to Camden's widow because she's the only person who's loved me without wanting something in return. She's the only one who saw me as a person instead of a paycheck. That's what family should be." When Margaret finished playing the recording, the courtroom was completely silent. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict in my favor. They upheld Theodore's will completely and rejected all claims of undue influence or mental incompetence. But the legal victory was just the beginning of the aftermath. The judgment didn't just preserve my inheritance. It destroyed Bryce and Kendra's reputations in their small community. Theodore had been well known and respected, and the details of the trial became local gossip. The recordings, now part of public court records, revealed the extent of their callousness toward their dying father. Their friends and colleagues learned how they had treated Theodore's cancer diagnosis as an inconvenience and his generosity as an entitlement. Bryce's startup company, already struggling, collapsed completely when his business partners learned about the trial. Who wants to invest with someone who calculated tax strategies while his father was dying? His reputation in the tech community was permanently damaged. Kendra's social circle in her upscale suburb turned cold after details of the case became public. The other mothers at her children's private school whispered about how she had treated her dying father. Her marriage to Preston, already strained by financial pressure, began to crumble under the added shame. But the most devastating consequence for both of them was the loss of their children's respect. Madison and Tyler, now old enough to understand what had happened, learned that their mother had prioritized money over their grandfather's well-being. Bryce's teenage daughter Emma stopped speaking to him entirely after listening to the recordings online. 6 months after the trial ended, I received a call from Madison, now 16 and living primarily with her father following her parents' divorce. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how Mom treated Grandpa. I would have visited him if I'd known he was so sick." "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her. "You were a child. You trusted the adults in your life to make good decisions." "Can I ask you something?" she said. "What was he like at the end? Was he happy?" I thought carefully about how to answer. "He was at peace. He felt loved and cared for. He talked about you and Tyler all the time, how proud he was of you both. He never stopped being your grandfather, even when he was disappointed in your parents." Madison started crying. "I miss him so much. I keep thinking about all the visits we didn't make, all the phone calls we didn't return because Mom said he was fine." This was the real tragedy of Bryce and Kendra's choices. Not just what they'd done to Theodore, but what they'd stolen from their own children. Madison and Tyler had lost years of relationship with their grandfather because their parents had prioritized money over connection. I established a college fund for both of Theodore's grandchildren from the inheritance, something I knew he would have wanted. When I told Madison about it, she cried harder. "Why are you being nice to us after everything our parents did?" "Because you're not responsible for their choices," I said. "And because your grandfather loved you completely, even when he was hurt by their behavior. This is what he would have wanted." Tyler, now 14, eventually reached out too. He was angry at his parents in the way only a teenager can be, completely black and white, unforgiving of their hypocrisy. He moved in with his father after the divorce and refused to speak to Kendra at all. "She lied to us," he told me during one of our phone calls. "She told us Grandpa was fine, that he didn't need visitors because he was resting, but he was dying and alone." "He wasn't alone," I corrected gently, "and he understood that you didn't know the truth about his condition. He never blamed you for your parents' decisions." These conversations with Theodore's grandchildren helped heal something in me that the legal victory hadn't touched. The trial had vindicated Theodore's decision and exposed his children's behavior, but it hadn't brought him back. Connecting with Madison and Tyler felt like honoring his memory in a way that went beyond money or legal documents. 3 years later, I still live in Theodore's house, surrounded by reminders of both him and Camden. I've turned Theodore's study into a reading room, keeping his books but adding my own. His recliner sits by the window where he used to watch birds in the garden. I've used part of the inheritance to start a foundation that provides support for family caregivers, people like me who find themselves caring for loved ones through serious illness. The foundation offers respite care, support groups, and emergency financial assistance for medical expenses. Bryce eventually moved across the country, claiming he needed a fresh start. His ex-wife told me he's working for a tech company in Oregon, living in a studio apartment and rebuilding his life slowly. He's never contacted me or apologized for his behavior during Theodore's illness. Kendra's life fell apart more dramatically. The divorce left her with minimal assets, and she's struggled to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She works as a real estate agent now, barely making ends meet in a small apartment. Her relationship with her children remains fractured. Last year, on the anniversary of Theodore's death, Kendra called me. It was the first time we'd spoken since the trial. "I've been thinking about Dad," she said, her voice small and uncertain, "about the things I said during his illness. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to tell someone who knew him that I'm sorry." I listened as she talked about her regrets. her attempts to rebuild relationships with her children, her recognition of how badly she'd handled her father's death. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I lost. Not the money, the relationship. I can't remember the last time Dad and I had a real conversation, one where I actually listened to him instead of thinking about what I needed." I surprised myself by feeling sympathy for her. "He never stopped loving you," I told her. "He was hurt and disappointed, but he never stopped being your father. Do you think—" She paused, struggling with the words. "Do you think he would have forgiven me eventually, if he'd lived longer?" "I think he already had," I said, and realized I meant it. He understood that people make mistakes, that family relationships are complicated. He just wanted to be seen as more than a source of money. We talked for another hour, the longest conversation Kendra and I had ever had. She asked about Theodore's final days, the things he'd said, whether he'd been in pain. I told her about his peaceful moments, his jokes with the nurses, his pride in his grandchildren. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected: closure. Not because Kendra's apology changed what had happened, but because it confirmed that Theodore's decision had been about more than money. It had been about teaching his children the difference between transactional relationships and genuine love. 5 years after Theodore's death, I've learned to see the inheritance not as money I won or deserved, but as a final gift from a man who had learned to value authentic connection over biological obligation. He'd given me financial security, yes, but more importantly, he'd given me an understanding of what real family looks like. The inheritance allowed me to honor both Theodore's memory and Camden's legacy. I've established scholarship funds in both their names, supporting students who show promise in engineering, Camden's field, and caregiving, the role I'd stumbled into but learned to embrace. Sometimes I sit in Theodore's garden, where I've planted roses in memory of both him and Camden, and I think about the strange journey that brought us together. I married Camden never imagining I'd outlive him, never thinking I'd become a widow at 29 or a caregiver to his father. But those unexpected roles taught me something valuable about love. It's not about blood or obligation or expectation. It's about showing up, paying attention, and choosing each day to see someone as worthy of care. Theodore didn't leave me his estate because I manipulated him. He left it to me because I loved him without keeping score, because I saw his dignity when others saw only opportunity, because I understood that family is something you create through action, not something you inherit through DNA. The money has been life-changing, but the real inheritance was the lesson Theodore taught me about the difference between taking care of someone and truly caring for them. That's a gift worth more than any bank account, and it's one that Bryce and Kendra can still claim if they ever learn to see people as more than transactions. In the end, Theodore got what he wanted most: the knowledge that he'd been loved completely and authentically, without agenda or expectation. And I got something I'd never expected: a second father who taught me that sometimes the family that chooses you is more real than the family you're born into. I faked being unconscious after my car accident to hear what my family really thought, and it changed everything. The crash happened on Highway 9, just outside town. Some drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned my Honda at 60 miles per hour. I remember the sickening crunch of metal, the sound of glass exploding like fireworks. Then nothing until I woke up in the hospital with machines beeping around me like an electronic symphony. I wasn't seriously hurt. Minor concussion, some bruising, a few stitches on my forehead. Nothing life-threatening, according to the nurses. But when I heard familiar voices arguing in the hallway outside my room, something deep in my gut told me to keep my eyes closed and listen. How long until she wakes up? That was Dad's voice, strained and tired. Could be any time now, the doctor replied professionally. She's stable. Very lucky, considering the severity of the impact. Head injuries are unpredictable, but her scans look good. Then I heard Mom's distinctive heels clicking against the linoleum as she entered the room. Dad followed, along with my older brother Trevor. I could smell Mom's expensive perfume mixed with the antiseptic hospital smell. "Well," Mom said, her voice unusually cold and businesslike. "At least now we know the truth." "Know what?" Trevor asked, confusion evident in his tone. Dad cleared his throat nervously. "About the will. Your grandmother's will." My blood went cold. "What will?" "Grandma Ruth had died just last month, and while I knew there'd been some family meetings about her estate, no one had mentioned anything about a will specifically naming me. Your grandmother left everything to Cassie," Mom continued, and I could hear the bitterness creeping into her voice. "The house, the investments, the life insurance, all of it. We found the papers in her safe deposit box yesterday when the lawyer finally let us in. I'd been wondering why they seemed so secretive and concerned about Grandma Ruth's estate since her funeral. She'd always been closest to me. We'd spent every Saturday together for years, baking cookies and talking about books, but I had no idea she'd left me anything significant." "How much are we talking about?" Trevor's voice was sharp, calculating. $800,000, Dad said quietly, like he was afraid someone might overhear. "Plus the Victorian house on Maple Street with all the antiques." The lawyer estimated the total value at over $1 million. The room went silent except for my heart monitor, which seemed to be beeping faster. I fought to keep my breathing steady and my face relaxed. "She's 18, Mom finally said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Legally, it's all hers the moment she turns conscious and signs the papers. No waiting period, no restrictions. Unless she can't sign them," Trevor said slowly, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. Another pause. This one felt dangerous. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Dad asked, his voice barely audible. "I'm saying accidents happen," Trevor replied, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. "Head injuries can cause permanent damage, memory loss, cognitive impairment, inability to make sound financial decisions." Mom's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The doctor mentioned she might have some confusion when she wakes up. That's normal with concussions. Exactly, Trevor said, warming to his theme. And confused people make poor decisions. They need family to help them navigate complex legal matters. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own family, the people who'd raised me, who I'd trusted completely, were discussing how to steal my inheritance while I lay supposedly unconscious in a hospital bed. We could have her declared incompetent, Dad said thoughtfully, his business mind clearly working. Temporarily, of course. Just until she's fully recovered and thinking clearly. Which could be months, Mom added quickly. Maybe years, depending on the severity of her cognitive issues. And in the meantime, someone would need to manage her affairs, Trevor finished, satisfaction creeping into his voice. Someone who cares about her best interests. The machines around me continued their steady beeping. I focused every ounce of willpower on keeping my breathing even, my face completely relaxed. One twitch, one change in my heart rate, and they'd know I was awake. It's not like we'd be stealing from her, Mom rationalized, and I could practically hear her convincing herself. We'd be protecting her. She's too young for that kind of responsibility. Look what happened to the Peterson girl. Inherited money at 19 and blew it all on drugs and bad boyfriends. Besides, Dad said, his voice growing stronger, Ruth should have left the money to us anyway. We're the ones who took care of her for years. We visited every week, handled her doctor appointments, managed her prescriptions when she got forgetful. Cassie just showed up for cookies and stories, Trevor added bitterly. But somehow she's the favorite grandchild. I remembered those Saturday afternoons completely differently. While they'd been busy with their own lives, I'd been the one who noticed when Grandma Ruth started repeating herself. I'd been the one who gently suggested she stop driving at night. I'd been the one who held her hand during chemo treatments when the rest of the family was mysteriously busy with work emergencies and prior commitments. Those Saturday visits weren't just about cookies and stories. Grandma Ruth had been teaching me about life, about money management, about trusting my instincts. She'd shown me her investment portfolio, explained how compound interest worked, discussed the importance of having financial independence. She talked about the family business that Dad had run into the ground, the multiple loans they'd asked her for over the years, the way they'd started treating her like a bank instead of a beloved mother and grandmother. The important thing is moving quickly, Mom said, her voice becoming more businesslike, before she fully recovers and starts asking difficult questions. I already researched the legal requirements, Trevor said, and the pride in his voice made me sick. We need medical documentation of cognitive impairment, testimony from family members about her inability to make sound decisions, and a court petition filed within 30 days of the incident that caused the incapacity. Dr. Harrison went to high school with me, Mom added. I could talk to him about emphasizing the confusion and memory issues in his medical reports. Perfect, Dad said. And I'll handle the financial side. Set up a conservatorship account, get the legal paperwork started, maybe even look into investment opportunities that could benefit the whole family. They continued planning for another hour, their voices occasionally dropping so low I had to strain to hear. Trevor would research conservatorship laws and find a lawyer who specialized in quick proceedings. Mom would work on Dr. Harrison and document every sign of confusion I showed. Dad would locate all of Grandma Ruth's assets and prepare to transfer them into a family-controlled conservatorship account. When she wakes up, we need to be extremely careful about what we say and how we present information, Mom warned. Document everything. Any confusion, any memory problems, any signs that she's not thinking clearly or making rational decisions. I'll start recording our conversations with her from day one, Trevor added. Build a comprehensive case for the court showing that she needs protection. And remember, Dad said, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he used in failed business meetings, we're doing this for her own good. She'll thank us someday when she's older and wiser and realizes how much trouble we saved her. The casual way they discussed destroying my life and stealing my future was breathtaking. They'd already convinced themselves that robbing me was somehow a noble act of protection. After they finally left, I lay there in the darkness processing what I'd learned. These people, who'd sung me lullabies and helped with homework and celebrated every birthday and graduation, were planning to rob me blind. Worse than that, they were going to use my supposed brain injury as the weapon to accomplish their theft. But they'd made one critical mistake in all their scheming. They assumed I was actually confused and vulnerable. I wasn't. In fact, lying there listening to their betrayal, I'd never been thinking more clearly in my life. The next morning, I decided to play their game better than they could ever imagine. When Dr. Harrison came in for his morning rounds, I pretended to wake up slowly, blinking in apparent confusion at the bright fluorescent lights. Where am I? I asked, making my voice sound weak and uncertain. You're in St. Mary's Hospital, sweetie, he said gently, his voice taking on that overly patient tone doctors use with confused patients. You were in a serious car accident 2 days ago. Do you remember anything about what happened? I stared at him blankly, letting my eyes lose focus slightly. Car accident? No. I don't remember anything. My head hurts so much it's hard to think. He made detailed notes on his clipboard, exactly the kind of medical documentation my family was hoping for. Within minutes of Dr. Harrison leaving, my family arrived like vultures circling wounded prey. Mom rushed to my bedside with tears in her eyes. Quite the Oscar-worthy performance. Oh, honey, we were so worried about you, she said, squeezing my hand with just the right amount of maternal concern. We've been here every day waiting for you to wake up. Mom? I made my voice uncertain, like I was struggling to place her face. What happened to me? Why can't I remember anything? Trevor moved closer, his phone already recording discreetly from his jacket pocket. You don't remember the accident at all? I shook my head slowly, then winced dramatically as if the movement caused severe pain. Everything's so fuzzy and strange. I can barely remember yesterday. Or was it yesterday? What day is it now? Dr. Harrison returned and launched into a detailed explanation about potential memory issues from head trauma, using medical terms that I pretended not to understand. Mom and Dad exchanged meaningful glances while maintaining perfect expressions of parental concern. "The important thing is that you're alive and safe," Dad said, patting my shoulder with false tenderness. "Everything else can wait until you're feeling completely better." But I could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the wheels turning as he processed exactly how to use my apparent confusion to his maximum advantage. Over the next few days, I gave the performance of my lifetime. I forgot conversations we'd had minutes earlier, acting confused when they reminded me of things we'd just discussed. I got confused about simple things: what I'd eaten for breakfast, what year it was, why I was in the hospital, whether I'd already taken my medication. I acted completely overwhelmed whenever they mentioned anything involving paperwork, legal documents, or financial decisions. "There are some important things we need to discuss about your grandmother's estate," Mom said carefully on the third day, watching my reaction like a scientist studying lab results. "Grandma Ruth?" I said, my voice small and confused. Is she okay? I feel like something bad happened, but I can't remember what." "She passed away last month, sweetheart," Dad said gently, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You were at the funeral, remember? You gave a beautiful speech about all those Saturday afternoons you spent together." I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. Real ones this time, because thinking about Grandma Ruth's death and funeral still caused genuine pain. "I don't remember any of that. Why can't I remember such an important thing?" "It's perfectly normal," Trevor said, his voice soothing while his phone continued recording my emotional breakdown. "The doctors explained that memory problems are completely expected after head injuries. Don't worry about anything complicated right now. But there are some papers that need to be signed," Mom added delicately. "Important legal things related to Grandma Ruth's estate. Nothing for you to worry about understanding. We can handle all the complicated financial and legal stuff." "It's too much," I said, pressing my hands to my temples in apparent distress. "I can't think straight about anything. Everything feels overwhelming and confusing." "Don't worry about any of it," Mom soothed, stroking my hair like I was a sick child. "We'll take care of everything until you're completely better. That's what family is for." Trevor filmed my entire emotional breakdown, building his legal evidence case with every tear and confused question. Mr. Peterson, Grandma Ruth's longtime attorney, came to see me on Thursday afternoon. He'd been handling her legal affairs for over 2 decades and needed my signature on various estate documents to finalize the inheritance transfer. I'd known him since I was a little girl. He'd always given me peppermints when Mom brought me to his office for various legal appointments. "Hello, Cassie," he said warmly, settling into the uncomfortable chair beside my hospital bed. "I'm so sorry we're meeting under these unfortunate circumstances. How are you feeling?" "Confused about everything," I admitted, letting my voice sound small and uncertain. "Everyone keeps talking about papers and legal things and money, but I don't understand any of it." Mr. Peterson pulled out a thick folder and began methodically explaining Grandma Ruth's will, the substantial cash inheritance, the valuable Victorian house, the diversified investment portfolio. My family watched my reaction like hawks, ready to pounce on any sign of confusion or inability to comprehend complex financial information. That's so much money," I said, looking at the numbers with apparent bewilderment and fear. "I'm just 18 years old. I don't know anything about managing money or investments or owning property. What am I supposed to do with a whole house?" "Perhaps," Mom interjected carefully, her voice full of false concern, "it would be better if someone more experienced and financially savvy handled these complicated matters until Cassie is fully recovered." Mr. Peterson frowned deeply, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "Are you suggesting some kind of formal guardianship or conservatorship arrangement?" "Just temporarily," Dad jumped in quickly, his business voice smooth and reasonable. "Until she's thinking clearly again and can make informed decisions. We don't want her to make any choices she might regret later when her mind is clearer." "The doctor said her confusion and memory problems could last for months," Trevor added helpfully, still recording everything. "Maybe even longer, depending on how her brain heals from the trauma." But Mr. Peterson wasn't buying their carefully rehearsed act as easily as Dr. Harrison had. He'd known me since I was little, had watched me grow up into an intelligent and capable young woman, knew exactly how sharp and perceptive I'd always been. "I'd like to speak with Cassie privately for a few minutes," he said firmly. My family protested immediately and loudly. What if I got confused or upset without them there for support? What if I had another memory episode? Shouldn't family members be present for important legal discussions involving someone with cognitive impairment? But Mr. Peterson insisted with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with difficult families, and his tone brooked no argument. After they reluctantly filed out of the room, shooting worried glances back at me, he pulled his chair closer to my bed. "Your grandmother was a very wise and perceptive woman," he said quietly, studying my face intently with sharp eyes. My stomach dropped. Did he know I was faking? Had I made some mistake in my performance? "What do you mean?" He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Grandma Ruth's distinctive, elegant handwriting. "She specifically mentioned this exact possibility in our last meeting before she passed away." "What possibility?" I asked, dropping some of my confused act despite myself. "That your family might try to interfere with your inheritance through legal manipulation," he said bluntly, watching my reaction carefully. She was growing increasingly concerned about their financial situation and their sudden interest in her estate planning. He handed me the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a letter that made my heart race and my hands shake. "My dearest Cassie, if Mr. Peterson is giving you this letter, it means your parents and brother have shown their true colors regarding your inheritance. I'm not surprised, though it breaks my heart into pieces. They've been dropping increasingly obvious hints for months about how young people can't handle money responsibly, how tragic it would be if someone made poor financial choices with a large inheritance, how important it is to have family guidance for major decisions. I've been testing them, dear one, asking their opinions about various scenarios, and they've failed every single test. The money is yours because you're the only person in our entire family who never asked me for it, never hinted that you deserved it, never made me feel like a walking ATM machine. You visited me because you genuinely loved spending time with me, not because you wanted something from me. You're the only one who noticed when I started getting forgetful, the only one who made sure I was eating properly, the only one who held my hand during those awful chemotherapy sessions. Don't let them take what's rightfully yours through manipulation or legal trickery. Trust Mr. Peterson completely. He has very specific instructions to protect your interests and ensure your inheritance reaches you safely. All my love and faith in you, Grandma Ruth. Tears filled my eyes. Real ones this time. As I finished reading her final message to me, Mr. Peterson leaned forward, his voice gentle but deadly serious. She also set up an extremely sophisticated trust structure that makes conservatorship virtually impossible without clear, documented evidence of permanent mental incapacity. And she recorded a detailed video testimony specifically documenting your mental sharpness, emotional maturity, and financial understanding. Your family can't touch this inheritance through legal manipulation, no matter what kind of case they try to build. But they think I'm brain damaged, I whispered, the full scope of their betrayal hitting me again. Are you? I met his eyes directly for the first time since the accident. Not even a little bit. He smiled, the first genuine warm smile I'd seen in days. I thought so. Your grandmother said you were the smartest and most perceptive person in the family, with better instincts than people twice your age. What do you want to do about this situation? That night, alone in my hospital room with machines beeping softly around me, I made my decision. I'd continue the charade just long enough to hear everything they were planning in complete detail. Then I'd make them pay for their betrayal in the most devastating way possible. The next day, Trevor arrived with legal documents he'd obviously printed from some sketchy online legal website. The papers looked official enough to fool someone who was actually confused, but I could see they were basic conservatorship forms that would give him complete control over my finances and legal decisions. These will help protect you and your future, he said, pointing to signature lines with an expensive pen. Just some simple paperwork that lets the family help manage complicated things while you recover your full mental capacity. I pretended to read the documents with great difficulty, moving my lips slightly and looking completely overwhelmed by the legal language and technical terms. I trust you completely, I said finally, picking up the pen with a visibly shaking hand. Mom practically held her breath. Dad moved closer, ready to witness my signature. Trevor's eyes gleamed with premature victory. Then I set the pen down carefully on the bedside table. But maybe I should wait until my head feels clearer and I can understand everything better. What if I'm making a terrible mistake? Trevor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The estate lawyer said time-sensitive matters shouldn't wait too long. There are strict deadlines and serious tax implications if we miss certain filing dates. Which lawyer exactly? I asked with innocent confusion. The one we hired specifically to help you navigate all this complicated legal stuff, Dad said smoothly, his lie flowing effortlessly. I'd never met this mysterious lawyer, of course. They were trying to rush me into signing away my rights to some stranger they'd probably found in a phone book or online advertisement. I'm so scared, I said, my voice breaking convincingly. What if I sign something wrong? What if I make a choice that somehow hurts our family financially? That's exactly why you need us to help guide you through this, Mom said, taking my hand in both of hers. We love you more than anything. We'll never let anything bad happen to you. The crushing irony was suffocating. They were literally planning to rob me blind while claiming to protect me from harm. That afternoon, while they thought I was napping peacefully, I heard them arguing in increasingly heated whispers outside my room. She's not signing anything, Trevor hissed, frustration clear in his voice. We need to push much harder or find a completely different approach. If we're too aggressive about it, that Peterson lawyer will definitely get suspicious, Dad warned. He's already asking too many probing questions about our motivations. Then what's our alternative? Mom asked anxiously. Just sit around waiting indefinitely while she recovers and realizes exactly what she's inheriting? Maybe she won't recover, Trevor said, his tone turning dark and genuinely dangerous. Head injuries are notoriously unpredictable. Sometimes people never get back to their baseline cognitive function. The way he said it made my skin crawl with terror. There was something calculating and cold in his voice, something that went far beyond hoping for my natural confusion to continue indefinitely. What exactly are you suggesting? Dad's voice was barely audible. I'm suggesting we stop waiting passively for nature to take its course and start helping it along in the right direction, Trevor replied ominously. Silence stretched between them, heavy with terrifying implications. Trevor, that's... Mom started, but her voice trailed off uncertainly. That's what? He cut her off sharply. Smart? Necessary? Practical? She's standing directly between us and over $1 million. Do you want to go back to living paycheck to paycheck while she buys designer clothes and travels around the world? She's your sister, Mom whispered, but even she sounded uncertain and conflicted. She's a spoiled brat who never appreciated anything she had, Trevor snapped viciously. Grandma Ruth turned her into a precious little princess while the rest of us struggled financially. Well, now it's our turn to benefit. But if something actually happened to her? Dad's voice was troubled but not horrified. Accidents happen all the time in hospitals, Trevor said with chilling coldness. Medication errors, equipment malfunctions, unexpected complications from head injuries. Very tragic. But these things occur regularly. The insurance money from her accident would be quite significant too, Mom added quietly, and my blood turned to absolute ice. They were discussing my death like a routine business transaction. Exactly right, Trevor said approvingly. Plus, if she dies before signing any inheritance papers, the estate automatically goes to the next of kin according to standard state law, which would be us, Dad concluded with satisfaction. The nurse rotation changes at midnight, Trevor continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. There's usually a significant gap between rounds around 2 a.m., more than enough time to ensure her condition takes a sudden turn for the worse. I lay frozen in my bed, every muscle tensed with absolute terror. They weren't just planning to steal from me anymore. They were actively discussing murdering me for insurance money and inheritance rights. What about all the monitoring equipment? Mom asked, and I realized with horror that she was fully on board with their murder plan. I've been carefully watching the patterns for days, Trevor said with obvious pride. Temporary disconnections happen constantly. Patients moving around, loose connections, equipment malfunctions. By the time anyone responds to the alarms, it would be far too late to save her, and her existing condition would make it look completely natural, Dad added thoughtfully. Head injury victims can deteriorate suddenly without warning. Exactly. Very sad, very believable, very convenient for everyone involved. My heart was pounding so violently I was terrified they could hear it through the walls. I had to escape before 2 a.m., but how could I get away without revealing that I'd been conscious and listening to every word they'd said? They talked for another 20 minutes, refining their horrible plan with business-like efficiency. Trevor would handle the technical aspects. He'd been researching which medications could cause cardiac arrest when administered incorrectly. Mom would create a distraction to ensure the nurses were occupied elsewhere during the critical time window. Dad would establish a perfect alibi by being visibly present in the family waiting area when the tragedy occurred. Tomorrow night, Trevor said finally with cold determination. We'll do it tomorrow night. That gives us exactly enough time to prepare properly and ensures we're not rushing anything important. After they finally left, I lay in the darkness with my mind racing between terror and desperate planning. I had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save my own life without exposing that I'd been listening to every detail of their murder plot. Around 11 p.m., when the hospital grew quiet and the overnight nurses settled into their predictable routines, I carefully removed my monitoring devices one by one and slipped out of bed. I'd been secretly practicing moving normally when no one was watching, so I knew I could walk without the confusion and weakness I'd been displaying during the day. I found a phone at the nurse's station and called Mr. Peterson's emergency line with trembling fingers. I need help immediately, I whispered, my voice shaking with genuine terror. They're planning to murder me tomorrow night. What? Cassie, is that you? Where are you calling from? I'm at the hospital, but they think I'm unconscious. They've been planning to steal my inheritance, but now they want to kill me for the insurance money too. I'm calling the police right now, he said, his voice sharp with alarm. Can you get somewhere safe until they arrive? I think so, but, Mr. Peterson, I need you to know that I've been awake this whole time. I heard every single conversation they had. I've been pretending to be confused because I wanted to know exactly what they were really planning. Smart girl, he said with obvious pride. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of your quick thinking. Stay exactly where you are while I conference in Detective Morrison. 20 minutes later, Mr. Peterson arrived at the hospital with Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers. I met them in a small conference room and told them absolutely everything. Every conversation I'd overheard, every detail of their inheritance theft plan, every horrifying aspect of their murder plot. We need you to wear a wire tomorrow, Detective Morrison said after I'd finished my detailed statement. If we can get them on record discussing their plans to kill you, we'll have everything we need for attempted murder charges. What if something goes wrong? I asked, my voice small with fear. What if they somehow realize I'm recording them? We'll have undercover officers positioned strategically throughout the hospital, she assured me firmly. At the very first sign of real danger, we'll move in immediately. The next day was the longest and most terrifying of my entire life. I had to continue my confused act while wearing recording equipment and knowing my family was planning to murder me that very night. Every time Trevor smiled at me, every time Mom stroked my hair, every time Dad patted my shoulder affectionately, I wanted to scream in terror and rage. Around 8 p.m., they gathered in my room for what they clearly expected to be our final conversation together. How are you feeling tonight, sweetheart? Mom asked, her voice sickeningly sweet and caring. Really tired, I said honestly. My head still hurts constantly. That's completely normal for head injuries, Trevor said reassuringly. Brain trauma takes time to heal properly. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. The way he emphasized worse made my skin crawl with revulsion. We've been thinking carefully about everything, Dad said, sitting down beside my bed with false tenderness. Maybe it would be much better if you didn't have to worry about all that complicated legal stuff with Grandma Ruth's estate. It's far too complex for someone recovering from serious brain trauma. We found an excellent lawyer who specializes in protecting vulnerable people who can't make important decisions for themselves, Mom added smoothly. He thinks we should definitely set up a special protective account where we can manage everything properly for you. That sounds so much easier, I said, my voice small and grateful. I really don't want to make any terrible mistakes with something so important. You won't have to worry about anything at all, Trevor said, and his smile was absolutely chilling. We'll take care of every single detail. They stayed until visiting hours ended at 9 p.m., each of them taking turns reassuring me that they'd handle all the complicated financial and legal details. Their performance was absolutely flawless. Loving family members protecting their vulnerable daughter and sister from harm. If I hadn't heard them planning my murder in cold blood, I might have actually believed they genuinely cared about my well-being. At 1:45 a.m., Trevor returned to my room wearing scrubs he'd obviously stolen from a supply closet. He moved with practiced quiet, clearly expecting me to be unconscious and helpless. The undercover officer posing as a night custodian was mopping floors nearby, ready to intervene if absolutely necessary. "Cassie?" Trevor whispered softly, approaching my bed like a predator. "Are you awake?" I kept my breathing steady and my eyes closed, fighting every instinct to run screaming. He began systematically disconnecting my monitoring equipment, just exactly as he described in his detailed plan. Then he pulled a syringe from his pocket. Whatever he intended to inject me with would look like a natural complication from my head injury. "I'm genuinely sorry it has to be this way," he whispered. And for just a moment, he almost sounded truly sad. "But you never really appreciated what you had anyway." As he reached for my IV line with the deadly syringe, Detective Morrison and 3 officers burst through the door with weapons drawn. "Police! Step away from the patient immediately!" Trevor's face went through shock, absolute terror, and then pure rage in rapid succession. "This isn't what it looks like," he said desperately, still holding the syringe that would have killed me. "It looks exactly like attempted murder," Detective Morrison said coldly, "which is precisely what we expected, since we have you on tape planning this for the last 2 days." They arrested him on the spot while he screamed about frame-ups and misunderstandings. Mom and Dad were picked up at home an hour later. The police had been monitoring them too, and they'd been discussing their alibis and celebration plans via text messages throughout the evening. The trial lasted 4 months and made national news as one of the most shocking cases of family betrayal in recent memory. The prosecution had absolutely overwhelming evidence. My secretly recorded conversations, the murder weapon Trevor had brought to my hospital room, extensive financial records showing they'd been systematically stealing from Grandma Ruth for years, and detailed testimony from Mr. Peterson about their attempts to manipulate my inheritance through legal fraud. The media dubbed it the inheritance murder plot and covered every day of testimony. Legal experts called it a textbook case of family greed gone murderous. Victim advocacy groups used it as an example of how financial abuse can escalate to violence. During the trial, even more disturbing details emerged. Prosecutors revealed that my family had been planning their theft for over 6 months before the accident. They'd consulted multiple lawyers about conservatorship procedures, researched my medical history for any signs of mental health issues they could exploit, and even considered creating fake evidence of drug use to support incompetency claims. Most shocking was the revelation that they'd taken out a life insurance policy on me just 2 weeks before the accident, listing themselves as beneficiaries. The timing was so suspicious that investigators initially suspected they'd somehow caused the crash, though they ultimately couldn't prove it. Trevor's internet search history painted a horrifying picture of premeditation. He'd researched everything from medications that cause heart failure, to how long before brain injury patients wake up, to legal requirements for conservatorship proceedings. The prosecution presented dozens of screenshots showing his methodical planning. The defense tried to argue that it was all theoretical research, that they never intended to actually harm me. But the recorded conversations and Trevor's attempt to inject me with a lethal dose of potassium chloride destroyed any credibility they might have had. I testified from behind a protective screen, my voice steady and clear as I recounted every conversation I'd overheard and every detail of their plan to kill me for money. When the prosecutor asked why I'd pretended to be confused for so long, I looked directly at my family through the courtroom glass partition, because I needed to know who they really were beneath the masks they wore, I said clearly. And they showed me exactly that. They revealed themselves to be thieves and would-be murderers who valued money more than my life. The defense attorney tried to discredit my testimony by arguing that someone with a head injury couldn't be a reliable witness. Mr. Peterson countered by playing Grandma Ruth's video testimony, recorded just weeks before her death, in which she praised my intelligence and maturity while expressing concerns about my family's financial motives. "Cassie is the brightest young woman I've ever known," Grandma Ruth said from beyond the grave. "If she says something happened, you can believe every word. She notices things other people miss and has better judgment than most adults." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Trevor was convicted of attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, elder financial abuse, and fraud. He received 15 years to life. Mom and Dad were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse for systematically stealing from Grandma Ruth, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. They each received 8 to 12 years in state prison. The judge called it one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases of family betrayal he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. He specifically noted that the level of planning and premeditation made their crimes particularly heinous. The defendants attempted to murder their own daughter and sister for financial gain, Judge Martinez said during sentencing. "This represents a level of moral bankruptcy that shocks the conscience of this court." The inheritance was released to me immediately after the trial concluded. I used a substantial portion to finish college completely debt-free and establish a nonprofit organization specifically helping family violence victims and financial abuse survivors. I invested the rest exactly as Grandma Ruth had taught me during our precious weekend coffee dates. Diversified, conservative, focused on long-term growth rather than quick gains. The nonprofit, which I named the Ruth Foundation for Family Safety, grew rapidly. Within 2 years, we were operating shelters in 3 states and providing legal assistance to hundreds of victims annually. My story became part of our awareness campaigns, showing how financial abuse can escalate to life-threatening violence. I spoke at conferences across the country, sharing my experience and teaching others to recognize the warning signs of family financial manipulation. Law enforcement agencies invited me to train officers on inheritance-related crimes. Medical professionals learned how to identify patients who might be vulnerable to family exploitation. The media attention was overwhelming at first. I did interviews with major news outlets, appeared on true crime podcasts, and even consulted on a documentary about family betrayal. Every story emphasized the same message: trust your instincts, protect your assets, and remember that blood relation doesn't guarantee loyalty. I kept the Victorian house on Maple Street and turned Grandma Ruth's old sewing room into a comfortable office where I work as a full-time victim advocate. Every morning, I sit in the same rocking chair where she used to tell me stories about standing up for yourself, trusting your instincts, and never letting people take advantage of your kindness. She'd been absolutely right about everything, including my family's true nature hidden beneath their loving facade. 3 years after the trial, Trevor was stabbed by another inmate during a prison riot and spent 2 months in the prison hospital fighting for his life. Mom wrote me a heartbreaking letter asking if I'd visit him, claiming he'd found religion behind bars and desperately wanted to apologize for his actions. I never responded to her letter. Some bridges once burned should stay destroyed. My Aunt Rita, Mom's sister who lived across the country, reached out after seeing news coverage of the trial. She shared stories I'd never heard about my family's financial problems, their jealousy of Grandma Ruth's success, and their history of manipulating elderly relatives for money. Your grandmother called me the week before she died, Rita told me during a long phone conversation. She was worried about your parents' behavior and wanted someone else in the family to know about her will. She said she was afraid they might try to contest it or pressure you into sharing. Why didn't you warn me? I asked. She made me promise not to interfere unless you contacted me first, Rita explained. She wanted you to figure things out on your own, to see their true nature without outside influence. She said it would make you stronger. Even from the grave, Grandma Ruth had been protecting me and teaching me valuable lessons. Rita became my closest family connection, visiting regularly and sharing stories about our family history that my parents had never told me. She explained how my grandfather had built the family business from nothing, how Dad had slowly destroyed it through poor decisions and risky investments, how Mom had always resented her mother-in-law's financial independence. They used to complain constantly about how Ruth spoiled you, Rita said. They thought she should be helping them, instead of spending money on your education and activities. Last month, Dad was released on parole after serving his minimum sentence for good behavior. He showed up at my victim advocacy office, gray-haired and hollow-eyed, begging desperately for forgiveness and claiming he'd learned from his mistakes. You completely destroyed our entire family, he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. We made some terrible mistakes, but we never would have actually gone through with it. Trevor was just upset and talking crazy because he was scared about money. I looked at him calmly from behind my desk, surrounded by awards from victim advocacy organizations and photos from college graduation. You brought a syringe full of poison to my hospital room at 2 a.m. with the specific intention of murdering me. That wasn't crazy talk or empty threats. That was attempted murder, and only police intervention saved my life. But we're still family, he pleaded desperately. Blood is thicker than water. Your grandmother would want us to forgive each other and move forward together. Grandma Ruth left me that inheritance specifically because she knew exactly what kind of people you were, I replied firmly. She saw your true nature and your greed long before I did. She was protecting me from you. He tried to grab my hands across the desk, his desperation palpable. You can't live your whole life holding grudges against family. Bitterness and anger will destroy you from the inside. I'm not bitter or angry, I said, standing up and walking calmly to the door. I'm protected and educated about the reality of toxic relationships. There's a crucial difference. As building security escorted him from the premises, he turned back one final time. You'll regret this decision someday, he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. Family is everything in this world. When you're old and alone, you'll wish you had forgiven us. I closed the door firmly and locked it behind me. He was completely wrong about family being everything. Family isn't about blood relations or automatic obligations or forgiveness without genuine accountability. Real family is about mutual love and protection and putting each other's well-being above personal gain. I'd rather be completely alone than surrounded by people who'd murder me for insurance money. And I'm not alone anyway. I have chosen family now. People who love me for who I am as a person, not what I'm worth financially. People who celebrate my successes instead of plotting to steal them. People who would protect me from harm instead of causing it. My chosen family includes Mr. Peterson, who became like a grandfather to me, Detective Morrison, who still checks in regularly, Rita, who fills the mother role my biological mother never deserved, and dozens of other survivors I've met through my advocacy work. Every Sunday, I visit Grandma Ruth's grave and tell her about my week in detail. I update her on the nonprofit's progress, share funny stories from my advocacy work, and thank her repeatedly for teaching me to trust my instincts and protect myself from predators, even when those predators share your DNA. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't pretended to be unconscious that first day. Would they have found another way to steal from me eventually? Would they have escalated to murder anyway when legal manipulation failed? I'll never know for sure, but I'm eternally grateful I learned the truth when I did, because sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can be the most dangerous enemies you'll ever face. And sometimes the only way to survive your own family is to expose them completely for who they really are, underneath their masks of love and concern. The Ruth Foundation continues growing every year, helping more families recognize and escape financial abuse before it escalates to violence. My story has become a cautionary tale, a training tool, and hopefully a source of hope for others facing similar betrayals. Grandma Ruth's legacy lives on, not just in the money she left me, but in the wisdom she shared and the protection she provided even after her death. She taught me that real love means wanting someone to be safe and successful, not wanting to control or exploit them. That's the kind of family worth building, the kind of love worth trusting, and the kind of legacy worth passing on.